thanks to all of you for actually made time at the end of the day, despite all the rainy weather and being locked in at home, to take out the time to actually think through how we can support charities better. My presentation will primarily focus on the organization development aspect of supporting charities and how we can build a stronger, more resilient organization around programs. It won't focus too much on statutory or legal duties and responsibilities of trustees and volunteers. It's also a little bit more geared towards the shorter term. And so our immediate response, and that is what I will spend more time on without getting too detailed or too far off into the future. So it's more like a roadmap that we can use to support charities better at this critical time. And so Lawrence will be helping me with just the slides and going back and forth between them. And so do we have the slides for everyone? Thank you. Yes. So I think just to start off with, it's helpful to set some context on just some of the insights we've been hearing. Obviously, at CAF, we have a large base of charities that bank with us. We also provide charity advisory and support to certain charities. We manage grants with charities, and we run surveys with charities to really get a flavor of what's really happening in the sector. And so if we move to the next slide, I think some of the things that we found out through our surveys that we did, towards the end of March, beginning April, is that charities are essentially facing a spike in demand for services, but at the same time, there's been a drop in income. And a lot of charities are very concerned about whether they have the reserves and the funding to help them manage operations during lockdown and beyond. It's interesting because I think initially when we did the surveys, there was a lot of concern about whether we'll get funding now. And over time, the insights we're getting from our discussions with charities is there has been a lot of support and understanding in the sector, but increasingly charities are more worried about what happens in the longer term. And so once the immediate funding support dries up, is there, what happens next year, the year after that, and how we're adapting going to lead and affect us in the longer term. And so this was just some quotes on how charities are feeling. And if we go to the next slide, which speaks about how charities have actually adapted. And Michelle rightly said that we were just discussing how there are similarities across different geographies, across different kinds of charities and organizations. And it's almost, because of the nature of the situation and the COVID-19 crisis, charities have almost been forced to adapt. Sometimes initiatives have been planned for years, but haven't really seen a pickup. But in recent times, we've tried to leverage whatever digital skills and tools that are out there. We're looking at alternate ways of funding. And so there have been a lot of different things that charities are really trying hard to ensure that the communities that they serve are actually protected. And so in a survey we conducted in April, we saw that 58% of charities are actually now working remotely. This is obviously more challenging for frontline teams who actually depend a lot on face-to-face interaction with community members, but there has been a shift to remote working. And along with that, a significant number of charities have changed the way they deliver the service or the way they reach out to community members and beneficiaries. And there's a lot of thinking and planning that's going on right now. And I think what will be interesting is in the longer term to ensure that we actually learn from this period and hold on to what has worked well and use that to sort of build platforms in the future as well. Along with that, we've seen a lot of charities refocus their activities. I'll be speaking a little bit more about this on how to, hold on to the core charitable purpose, but shift around how we deliver service or how we change around activities. But that's because of the need in the community right now, and amongst beneficiaries, a lot of charities have been forced to adapt how they deliver activities. And the last is just that there have been a lot of formal as well as informal collaborations between organizations, and how they're responding to the, and some of this is driven by how the need to respond to the community need, as well as the need to pool in resources and sort of work together at this time of crisis. So this is just more, just context to show us how charities actually working hard to adapt, and then how we could potentially support them in some of these initiatives. And so, moving on to the next slide, we'll now be shifting gears and focusing more on what is the role that volunteers and trustees can play in helping charities adapt, and to ensure that there's still a strong and resilient organization around the key programs being delivered in the community. And so moving ahead, this is really a broad roadmap. It looks very linear, and I don't think the stages may essentially be linear. But I think if I had to really bucket the kind of how the charities may need to react in this environment, the first is almost to respond to the crisis. And that stage is focused very much on minimizing the risks, identifying what is working, what is not working, understanding risks across the different levels within the organization, and really trying to survive, making ends meet. And I think a lot of the current phase is responding to the crisis and just ensuring that charities have, are undertaking those actions to survive the crisis. But very soon we'll almost be shifting gears, and in a few months the focus will shift from we've survived in this critical period, but there is now a need to stabilize programs, stabilize operation, bringing the conversation back to what have we learned from this crisis. And I think what's unique about this phase, and what is something that can be very easily forgotten, is learning from the crisis. And so focusing on organization development, re-looking at programs, but also with the lens of how did we respond to the crisis? What have we learned from our response? Who are the other partners and champions who have supported us? And using all of those lessons to really then figure out in the future, how do we regrow our impact? And so once we've managed operations, once we've recovered and learned from the crisis, that is when, and this would probably be a year and a half from now, where organizations will be in a better position to really understand, go back and expand on the impact that they are creating. And so that's a broad framework or roadmap, but we'll spend a little more time now on respond, going to the next slide. And our response actually starts with identifying who our champions are. And our champions are our stakeholders across different levels. And of course, there may be stakeholders that I haven't mentioned that are relevant for the organization. But I think both from the leadership as well as the trustee or volunteer perspective, what's really important is to actually sit down and map out our stakeholders across the different groups, be that in the community, within the organization, our frontline staff, our management staff, leadership positions, or our partners who may be supporting us with funding or to deliver, or even the government or other partners that may be relevant for your organization. And I think at this stage, it's important to literally document or have a database of all of those relationships and identify some of the risks, identify where these different stakeholders stand, and then understand your response with respect to each of these stakeholder groups. And so moving to the next slide, this actually is, once all stakeholders are mapped and once we have a better sense of, what is the need across the community, organization, and across partners, that is when we can work with the leadership team of organizations to look internally and really help them make some hard choices. Because I think what's evident is there is almost a need to do more with less. Resources are constrained, and it's going to take time to recover. It's going to take time for the economy to recover, for socio-political systems to change. And I think charities are already constrained, and this is putting that added level of constraint on them. And so with that in mind, these are just some of the quick things we can help the leadership teams of organizations think through as they plan their response to the crisis. And if there's only one thing that you sort of take away from this session and from this slide, it would be to protect the organization's core. And what that really means is understanding what is the purpose of the organization. And so I think often we use, we get confused between the means and the ends. And so, for example, your organization may exist to serve a particular community, and the means to do that may be through an education program or through distributing food or through other, activities. But the end is really to protect the community and to serve the community. And I think having a very clear sense of what is that non-negotiable for the organization and what is that end that they're working towards is one of the key things to figure out. Second is, of course, the people, and the people who deliver on the front line, the people who make the organization. And it's a difficult time. A lot of organizations have had to furlough staff. There's a lot of uncertainty, but really what can we do given the constraints, and whatever we can do in our capacity to protect our people and keep their best interests at heart. And the third aspect of the core are our principles. And of course, different organizations may describe this differently, but I think it's almost like your ethos and culture of how you do what you do. And I think what protecting your core or really helping organizations define that core will help them like I said, decide between what's negotiable, what's non-negotiable, and it's going to be a time for tough decisions to be made, and hopefully that will provide that framework to take those decisions. And along with that, once that is done, like I said, communicating the score and aligning with your stakeholders on this is what is core to the organizations. These are why we may be taking certain decisions, or why we may choose to deliver certain activities, and having that all recorded and sort of communicated more widely would help bring along our stakeholders on this journey. The third and quite important thing to do, of course, is also planning for risks and contingencies, but being agile, knowing that everything is changing, and there's like right now, no one really has the answers. And there are a lot of variables that remain to be seen, but that doesn't mean that we don't plan, because hopefully if we plan, then some of that uncertainty and some of the things that we can't predict will hopefully become a little clearer over time. And what that means is maybe we started the year with a certain fundraising target. We need to plan about what happens if maybe we achieve just 75% of that target, or what happens if we achieve just 50% of that target. How does that impact our programs, our people, and the way we do things? And so doing some amount of that scenario analysis would just help the leadership, first of all, realize when some things or some issues are not as bad as they expect, but also predict some of those things that may become issues in the future, and being a little more prepared for that. And I think related to that, once you've of course communicated across different stakeholders, but equally it's important to really engage funders through this process, because funders want to help. It's just a very, very difficult time, and understanding how we can engage them through the process so that it's not just about a funding ask, but really getting their insights, using their networks, understanding whether our strategies even make sense in the current environment, would be useful. And the next thing is just to collaborate purposefully. I think there's a lot being said about collaboration. We know that charities are collaborating formally, informally, and I think it's important to protect your core while doing that, because not all collaborations or partnerships may make sense. Some may make sense in the shorter term, but not in the longer term. But being very clear about your own trade-offs, your own organization, and what you want to do will be helpful in deciding what to collaborate on. And the last thing that I won't be focusing too much on, because it's a little bit beyond my own expertise, is just ensuring compliance. And of course, there are a lot of resources with the Charities Commission on the government website, NCVO, on what are the trustee legal obligations and things that need to be met. But across the board, that's definitely one of the core things to focus on at this time, especially when it comes to changing around activities in the community, being very mindful of what are some of those things that we need to put in place to ensure that we're still complying with our government governing docs, or that our communities are still protected. And so I think that are some of the broad ideas around how we can help organizations think through their response to COVID-19. And so moving on, I'll go into the next slide. We'll spend a little bit more time on just fundraising. And I think I've tried to split this between what you focus on internally in the organization and how you strengthen the organization. And so this slide is on that, which really starts with reviewing financials, reallocating costs, and rebudgeting. And what that means is going back to the funds that we already have raised, understanding what is restricted, unrestricted. If something is restricted, can we go back to the donors and have a conversation and understand if there's any flexibility around either the timelines of those projects, or how we're able to deliver them, or can we actually repurpose some of those funds for other things. And then rebudgeting, very similar to the scenario analysis that I spoke about, or what would 100% budget look like, what does a 50% budget look like. And I think this is based on the funds that we have, where can we find flexibility, and going back and having those conversations where possible to help us manage this crisis. And then once that is done, once we have a more realistic sense of the funds that we have at our disposal, as well as the funds that we think that we may be able to raise through the year, creating a very focused and time relevant case for support. And what that means is, unfortunately, there are some charities that will actually receive more interest at this time, especially those working on health, those working on food delivery or essential services. And there may be some charities that are adversely affected by it, because so for example, if a charity is working on art, that may not seem as critical or as urgent a need right now, but perhaps what would be important is try to relate that to the current context and social environment. And so if art is used as maybe a therapy for, to support people through social isolation, for mental health, which is of course again very relevant given the lockdown and given the health crisis, then figuring out how we can tweak our case of support to ensure that it is relevant to the current context when we have to raise funds in the immediate term. And then once we've built that case of support, keeping in line the core of the organization, whether we are comfortable with it or not, there would be a need to build a digital presence around that case for support. And of course, there are lots of different organizations and platforms out there, but really leveraging what resources you already have. And so if there is a website, is that talking about the charity's COVID response? Is that talking about the current case of support that the charity needs, as well as do you allow for online donations, or can you set up pages on CAF or other organizations which allow for online donations? And also, just around social media, can we use LinkedIn, can we use Facebook or whatever, Twitter, depending on what the charity is comfortable in? How can we spread the message that this charity is focusing at this critical time on some of these key and urgent needs? And so that's more around building a digital presence around the case of support. And the last and very important thing is really developing a culture of philanthropy throughout the organization. And so I think very often, because of course we want to streamline roles and responsibility, but fundraising then becomes the responsibility of just the fundraising manager or a particular leader or a particular trustee. But really our fundraising champions exist throughout the organizations, and our frontline staff talks about it. Our communities also actually talk about the work that we're doing. And so just having a kind of understanding or those key messaging at this time period of what the organization is doing, what the needs of the organization for, and having everyone across the organization take ownership of that is another thing that would be helpful as you think through fundraising. And so moving on to some of the things that we focus on externally, and just starting out with, one of the most important things is to stay in tune with your current donors. The likelihood of current donors supporting us further is higher right now than trying to cultivate new relationships, and especially a lot of donors have put messages out there on how they want to be more flexible and more supportive, and so going back to your current donors, but really understanding and empathizing where they're coming from. They may not be able to give you funds right now, however maybe they can just share some insights on what else they're seeing among the other charities they're supporting, or what networks they have. And so not necessarily, but really having a sense of where that donors coming from, what are their constraints, and then understanding how to best leverage that relationship as we fundraise in the future as well. The second thing, of course, is there are a lot of emergency grant programs that have been launched, various different formats and criteria. And I think, CAF has run its own emergency grants program, and having gone through a lot of the applications and been on the sort of the scoring end of that, I think because of the volume of applications that each of these grant programs are receiving, it's really important to be very careful about the application, the messaging. And so the case of support, how does that translate into what is being put in the grant application? Regulatory aspects on ensuring that if bank statements have been requested, the most recent bank statements are uploaded or in the format that that particular donor has applied, has requested for. And ensuring that even simple things like ensuring that the number of the charity is has been updated correctly. I think because of the strain in the sector right now and just the volume of applications, it's the likelihood of succeeding is lower, and hence that need to be really, really careful with grant applications right now. And then, of course, I spoke about this earlier, but we actually don't know when we'll be going back, to offices, what that new normal would look like, or how we'd go back to fundraising events. And so some organizations, some charities have this, some don't, but it would probably just be a longer term strategy as well, to just have a platform that will enable online donations to your charity. And of course, collaborate for fundraising. Sometimes organizations come together if they work on a certain theme and raise funds for a particular cause. So they pooled in resources to raise funds for a particular theme, and then that can be distributed. Or if you're working in the same community, maybe there are different roles that you play to support members of that community. And so think through how to best leverage your peers in this initiative. And of course, exploring alternative funding options. And that means some charities are largely grant reliant, some charities have income generating activities, some charities take loans. And I think there's no one way to fundraise, especially at a time like this, and even for future sustainability. It's really important to have a healthy mix of options. And so some amount of grant funding, some amount of income generating activities, or some amount of loans or other investments, or just ways that donations can be processed. And so that's just a few quick tips and tricks on fundraising and just things to be mindful of. And so if we move to the next slide, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because this is in the slightly longer term. It's focus more on how can we learn from the crisis, how do we need to sort of go back to our strategies and rethink things just with the current context. But this is more like a guide to frame a recovery strategy for the charities. And so again, it's not necessary that all charities will do all of these steps, but some of these steps may be helpful, especially in the longer term as you look to recover from the crisis. And it really starts with, again, reflecting internally on our risk and resilience factors. And so where have the charities actually done well during the crisis? What has enabled them? What are some of those barriers? And what gaps have you really identified through this crisis period? And then, so that's one part of it. And then the second part of it is really analyzing the broader landscape, because funders have changed, the environment has changed, the way the government and local authorities will work with charities would have changed. And so at a certain point in the future, it would be important to sort of go back and really invest in some of that research into understanding the shifts in the sector. And of course, there's a lot of freely available research out there. CAF shares its own freely available research. There are other organizations that are doing the same. But having a facilitated conversation with the leadership and the rest of the team to really understand what that means for that particular organization is important. And then both of these factors would be able to inform the organization whether they need to revisit their strategy or not. And that's really focusing on the why, what, and how of how the charity will go on in the future. And some charities may just need small tweaks, some charities may actually need an overhaul. And so it would be important to take that decision when the time is right. Optimizing programs for impact, that just means that we have to do more with less. uh, Resources are a constraint, costs need to be managed, and so we really need to almost do an analysis of which programs are most impactful, how much those programs cost, and then sort of come up with that mix or that portfolio of interventions or programs that the organization will want to try in the future. And then on the basis of that, review the fundraising ask and go back to the donors. And now that we actually have the lessons from the crisis, we can say that we actually have identified these risks. We need to invest in core funding, we need unrestricted grants, and all of these factors together will help you build a more resilient organization around the programs. And that is more, again, all of these steps are more for the future, but a really important phase of reflection to follow the current stage. And so if there are actually only three things that I guess I leave you with, it would be protecting the core, rallying your stakeholders, and then building a more resilient organization in the future. So let me pause now, and maybe we can take some of the questions that have come in.
Thank you so much, Anisha. And we can stop screen sharing for a minute and just have some questions. I think it's interesting that you picked up on those 3 points, because there was a lot of information there and clearly a lot of thought and research that's gone into it. And we're really grateful. For me, the protect the core really stood out. And I think thinking about the stages and the relationships, it was reassuring to hear the uncertainty and unpredictability as well that we're all feeling, I think. And the interesting take on the fundraising, the internal and external, and finally that strategic reflection piece to build resilience. So just to kind of get ourselves in the zone of all the things that Anisha talked about was really, really helpful. We've got a couple of questions that have come through, and we had a couple of questions that were already submitted. So I'm going to go to the ones that were already submitted, and then we'll take some of the ones as well that are coming through. So the first question that was already asked was about how organisations reliant on traditional fundraising channels like charity galas and retail shops can respond in the current environment. So it's interesting to understand what your thoughts are around that. So our traditional or our previous channels of funding, how do we respond if we can't do that right now?
Thanks. So actually, again, and I guess for galas or retail shops, it would be slightly different. But I think the first question that charities as a sector we need to reflect on is, is this something that has a longer term effect? And so if we are talking about retail stores, for example, is the move and the need to use digital platforms for retail, is that going to be a trend that will stay even beyond the COVID-19 survival phase? Or with galas, there's a lot of activity and interest that we do generate through galas, but is Zoom calls or other platforms of engagement here to stay? And then do we need to build a strategy around that? And I think that would be organization specific, but once it's clear that some of this is a longer term investment, it's actually a great time to experiment with some of those new platforms, because digital may not be a natural, or has not been tried as much in the past, but this period has really forced us to embrace certain tools. And so even when we're talking about galas, and it's not necessary that we'll have the gala in exactly the same way, but going back and understanding why did those donors or why did those individuals come to those galas, and is there a platform or an avenue to provide them that feeling of community, or that feeling of being a part of the purpose of the organization through digital platforms. And the great thing is that right now there are actually a lot of platforms that are available, and some freely available platforms, which actually may not be a concept in the future. And so it's a good time to actually experiment with some freely available tools, and again, depending on the nature of the donor and the needs of the donor, really figuring out, maybe you do small group discussions on certain themes. Like there'll be certain donors who are really interested in the theme or the cause area of the charities, but there may be others who want to feel a part of a larger community or be a part of something like, has a lot of peers in it. And so for them, it's, you could literally do either auctions or games or different ways to make them a part of the community. But like I said, the key thing would be figuring out, is this a long-term shift that the charity wants to do? If yes, what are the digital platforms that we can experiment with, and then basis that decide where we can invest in some of these. And a lot of the themes that I spoke about in the presentation of having a focused case for support, building a presence around that through social media, through your website, to drive traffic towards that. And then actually having, even in the platform that you use, at the end of the event, there has to be a call to action. And so there's a way that allows, people, participants of that event or that platform to donate to you, or to provide their skills or volunteer or other ways of engaging with you. And similarly for retail, if retail is a way to go in the future for, and it does contribute significantly, thinking through how online retail may actually look like in the future, because I think a lot of people right now, people even who weren't comfortable with online shopping, have started doing online shopping, and there will be a group of people who will go back to traditional shopping, but there will also be a group of people who and an expanded group of people that you can reach out through online channels. And so I'd say thinking through some of that, using the freely available tools to experiment. People are more receptive right now. So make mistakes fast, learn from them, and then figure out the longer term strategy.
I'm unmuting myself. Interesting, thinking about the dynamism, and you're not the first person to say, I think people are being more forgiving. There's a more forgiving, we're more forgiving and able to tolerate the fact that this is challenging. We're trying things, so it's a good time to try when we're forced to. There's another question that we've had around sustainability. I'm going to kind of join two questions, and then I can also see that there are quite a few questions about restricted and unrestricted funds, so we'll come to those in just a second. But the next couple of questions I'm just going to join together. There's one about community-based charities being sustainable, and another about why can organizations not merge? Like, what is it about thinking about smaller organizations of similar aims and objectives merging to meet charitable purposes? So if we it's two parts of a not totally the same but similar question around, I suppose, sustainability and merging, and thinking about what are the things that are important for us to understand in terms of responding and recovering.
Thanks. So I think in terms of sustainability, and there are two, I guess, aspects of it. One is, of course, the funding channels. The other is the programs themselves. And so matching impact and the impact that the programs are creating with the funding channels, and doing that trade-off is really critical. And I think once an organization is convinced that at this particular cost, this program leads to a specific level of impact, which is really important to us, because that is in line with the core purpose of the organization. Then trying to figure out what are the different sources of funds available that can support that particular program. And I touched upon this a little bit during the webinar as well, but diversifying funds may not be just to stop grant funding and only being reliant on income generating activities, because at a time of crisis, it's difficult to know what sources are more useful, and having a mix of that sources, just like we try to mix up our investments so that we across the portfolio we're safe. It's very similar there. And so, for example, even if I look specifically at grant funding, is all our grant funding only from a particular type of donor, or do we have a mix of donors? Do we have maybe some government funding, some corporate funding, some large trusts, some individual donors? And the more we diversify, that will help us in these risky situations. Having said that, having those core funders or supporters who are there to fall back on, who've been supporting us for a long time, they sort of give that flexibility to experiment more with other sources of funding. And so it's almost like you'll need a certain percentage of your funds from your core donors, who will be long-term legacy relationships that you'll be managing, and then try to add on different components of grants, income generating activities, or loans or other types of support. And to the point of charities merging, it's actually back to protecting your core. What is the core purpose of the charity? And I've done a lot of workshops, I've done a lot of individual conversations as well with charity leaders, and I often ask, what's your exit strategy? And how can you make, how can your organization be more sustainable? What's that vision for you? And across the years, one answer has always stuck in my mind, where a charity leader said, my vision is that I no longer need to exist, that my organization no longer needs to exist, because that means that the program has served its purpose and the impact has been created. And I think what that made apparent is he was able to put impact before the organization. Charities and different organizations exist to serve a particular purpose, and that purpose is more important than necessarily the infrastructure of that organization. And so for small charities, if there are a group of charities with a common purpose, who actually have shared values, shared culture, because that is not easy to replicate, and that can cause a lot of friction later. But if that core is similar, then one can think through merging on the basis of, cost optimization or sharing of resources. But I'd say easier said than done. Really thinking long and hard and finding the right organization that shares the organization's purpose, values, and principles would be the sort of the entry point of even then trying to figure out how mergers can potentially happen.
Really interesting. And I think we had a couple of comments in the chat just about mergers, and I don't think anyone's under any illusions that they are easy processes. And I think the points that you picked out are really important about the core, about values, and something important for us to reflect on in terms of sustainability. I think the last question that seems to have come up was around unrestricted funds. So we've got one asking about finding unrestricted funds, and I know that lots of us will be trying to find those, and I'm sure that if you have particular pointers to places that we may not have heard of or that we can circulate, that would be really helpful following this webinar. But there was a specific question around when contacting donors, asking them to donate as unrestricted funds. So examples of how funds can be specified, maybe asking them to trust the charities. So I think people talking about how we can ask for funds to be unrestricted. Do you think that's something that's important for us to make sure happens at the moment? How do we have those conversations around whether things are restricted or unrestricted at this time, and to what benefit is it for the charity to do that with those core donors that you said rightly so we should hold close to us?
Yes. So I think there's also a lot of skepticism and, your donors, they get a little afraid if you ask for unrestricted funds, because they're like, why you don't want to be held accountable, or what is going to happen with these funds. And it feels like this, very difficult conversation. I think probably staying away from the language is actually helpful at times. And so not going in with, I want unrestricted funds or I need core costs, but trying to emphasize that this is the program, these are the program outcomes that we want to achieve in whatever time frame, and we are absolutely accountable for achieving those program outcomes. Where we need flexibility is around how the activities that may achieve those outcomes, and so activities may need to change, and is to also build an institution around around the programs to be actually able to deliver. And so maybe going upfront and just asking for, say, monitoring and evaluation, cost for a monitoring and evaluation system, that may be difficult. But in a broader program, allocating a smaller percentage of that budget to build a monitoring and evaluation system, and then making the case of this will help us track, record, and help us give case studies to you, or help us learn more in the future, or will actually help us build greater accountability that we owe the communities as well, is helpful. And so I'd say try and reinforce that the accountability exists to the achievement of program outcomes, and not necessarily the very specific line items of how a particular budget item has been spent. And then also using COVID really as an opportunity. I spoke about the recovery phase and why it's important to learn from it, but also documenting some of those lessons on we did not have reserves because we didn't have any unrestricted funds, or we didn't have the money to invest in these systems that would have helped us go digital at this time. And really capitalizing on this time right now to initiate some of those conversations with donors, which may not work out immediately, but in the longer term. And to the point of resources, of course, CAF has the CAF COVID hub, which is, I've mentioned it in the presentation, which would be sent out to all of y'all. But yes, there are also, and so that itself maps out to various different sources of information, guides, and other other stakeholders like NCVO, etc., who can support.
Thank you so much, Anisha. And I really, really appreciate, or we really appreciate you taking time to be with us today, to share your insight, your expertise, and answer our questions. If you have any other questions, there's a few claps going on for you. Thank you. If you have any other questions that you'd like to field to Anisha, that you'd like us to find out for you, we will make sure that we send the link to your hub round with the slides. And I think a lot of food for thought, particularly at a time when sometimes things feel quite unfocused, but focusing us on that protecting the core, I think is going to stick with me, that real purpose of our organisations and what we're working towards. And again, I will say, in this week of thanking volunteers, thank you all for the work that you do to strengthen our organisations, to JVN for partnering with us, and Anisha from CAF for joining us. We have the Jewish Community Trustees Conference on the 2nd of July. We will share a link with you. We'll have an online event that we launch on the 2nd, with subsequent events that mean this year you need not miss any sessions, because they will all be available online on multiple days. So we will let you know when more information is out, but you have a sneak preview of our format this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Anisha, again, to JV and everyone else. Be well, take care.